Wait, they want to what? To divide it up into sections and list all the warships in each section? Do I think that sounds fishy? Nah, I mean, come on, what could possibly be suspicious about that, huh? Alright, bye. In the last 2 years, Adolf Hitler has sent his armies racing across Europe, taking ever more territory as nation after nation falls. But this week, something new happens. This week, a new nation emerges. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, Kiev, the third largest city in the Soviet Union, fell to the Germans. Leningrad, the second largest, had been surrounded and is also in danger of falling, and the Japanese launched a new offensive to take Changsha. This week, on the 26th, they make moves to encircle the city and drop paratroops for the first time this Eastern War. Those are not the only moves the Japanese are making this week, though. On the 24th, the Japanese consul in Hawaii is instructed to divide Pearl Harbor into 5 zones and report back the exact number of warships in each zone. American intelligence intercepts this message, but they don't have any decryption facilities, so they send it by plane to Washington, D.C. But the once-a-week flight, the 26th, is canceled by weather, so it's sent by sea. And jumping into the future, it does not reach DC until October 6th, and when it's finally decrypted a few days later, will not be considered more than a routine espionage assignment. There are, in fact, similar requests being made about other places in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia. Most of the world's focus, however, is still on the Soviet Union, where the German invasion continues. Last week in the north, the Germans captured Pulkovo and Alexandrovska, less than a dozen kilometers from Leningrad city center. But on the southern slopes of Pulkovo Heights, they are now stopped. As we saw last week, Georgy Zhukov had arrived in Leningrad to take control of the city defenses. He immediately issued orders to smother the enemy with artillery and mortar fire and air support, permitting no penetration of the defenses. By now, this has had an effect. Erich Hübner's panzers have not breached the Leningrad defenses. The Finns to the north of the city have stopped putting on pressure from that side, and despite the German attacks killing or wounding some 4,000 people a day in the city and starting fire after fire, Leningrad will hold for now, since most of the panzers are to be diverted for Operation Typhoon, the coming drive on Moscow. Sporadic fighting will continue into next week, but the Soviet defense here has convinced Army Group North Commander Wilhelm von Lieb that he can go no further. On the 24th, he reports that the situation has worsened to the point where he can no longer continue offensive operations and has no choice but to now play defense. Hitler does not accept this. In fact, a directive from the 22nd reads, "The Führer has decided to erase the city of Petersburg from the face of the earth. I have no interest in the further existence of this large city after the defeat of Soviet Russia." As for Typhoon, Hitler's orders for that operation back on the 6th call for the destruction of the forces blocking the Moscow road in the limited time which remains available before the onset of the winter weather. But you know, the German army that is to do this is not the same army that crossed the border June 22nd. This army has a strength of 500,000 men fewer, thanks to casualties and illness. Now, this is not much at all compared to Soviet losses, but it and logistical issues have seriously affected German morale. In fact, the 98th Infantry Division's diary has this to say about its 650-kilometer march after being diverted from Kiev towards Moscow. The modern general service carts with their rubber tires and ball-bearing mounted wheels had long since broken up under the stress of the appalling tracks and been replaced by Russian farm carts. Good quality German horses foundered daily through exhaustion and poor food. Equipment, including many tons of the divisional reserve of ammunition, had to be abandoned at the roadside for lack of transport to carry it. Gradually, the most simple necessities of life disappeared. Razor blades, soap, toothpaste. Even in September and before the advent of winter, there was incessant rain and a cold northeast wind, so that every night there was the scramble for shelter, squalid and bug-ridden though it usually was. The rain, cold, and lack of rest increased sickness that in normal circumstances would have warranted admission to hospital, but the sick had to march with the column over distances of up to 25 miles a day since there was no transport to carry them, and they could not be left behind in the bandit-infested forest. The regulation boots were falling to pieces. All ranks were filthy and bearded, with dirty, rotten, and verminous underclothing. Typhus was shortly to follow. This week, British intelligence sends Joseph Stalin a series of warnings based on readings of German vulture secret messages giving the details of German plans and movement toward Moscow. But the Germans still have mopping up to do in the south after the fall of Kiev. Andrei Vlasov's 37th Army is still active southeast of the city, though it gets surrounded in two separate groups, both of which fall by the 23rd. At the end of the week comes the end for Fyodor Kostenko's 26th Army, as they give in near Orzhitsa. Mikhail Potapov's 5th and Vasily Kuznetsov's 21st Armies, what's left of them, last until the 25th. After that, Potapov and his headquarters and bits of the 5th join Mikhail Kirponos's staff and try to break out to Peryatin. Kirponos, who commanded the southwestern front, is not with the staff. Here's what happens to him. Stavka is sending him message after message, like this one from Chief of Staff Boris Shaposhnikov, the 21st. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command demands that you report immediately. 1. Whether or not your units have abandoned Kiev. 2. If Kiev has been abandoned, whether or not the bridges have been blown up. 3. If the bridges have been blown up, then who will vouch for the fact that the bridges have been blown up? Shaposhnikov and Stavka get no answers to their questions because Kirponos is dead by this point. He and his staff had lost all communications with what's left of their armies anyhow. They managed to make it to Dryukovschina farm the 20th. That's like a couple hours southwest of Lokvica. Once there, though, they're attacked by the German 3rd Panzer Division and driven into the woods where they make their final stand. Kirponos, Potapov, their main staff, and some 2,000 men fight for several hours. Kirponos dies in the fighting, along with many of the soldiers, while Potapov and the rest are taken prisoner by the Germans. But while the Kiev encirclement may have been huge, and may have been spectacular, it was far from airtight, so little groups of Red Army soldiers do manage to break out, including Nikita Khrushchev, Semyon Budeny, and Semyon Timoshenko, and as you know, these are some heavy hitters. But it's hard to overestimate the scale of the Kiev disaster in any case. On September 1st, the Southwestern Front numbered 850,000 men, including reserves and service units. The encirclement at Kiev contained 452,700 POWs, of whom some 15,000 managed to escape. But if you add up all the casualties, killed, wounded, POWs, and missing, the Southwestern Front took 700,544 of them. 4 Soviet armies have ceased to exist. The door to the Donbass is open, as is the southern approach to Moscow. As for the Southern Front, or specifically the Odessa defensive region, which has been holding off the Romanian 4th Army for more than a month, well, they're starting to get a bit antsy and are considering an evacuation by now. On the 22nd, they launch an airborne and amphibious assault at Grigorevka that expands the defense perimeter by nearly 8 kilometers. But as the German 11th Army advances towards Crimea, it might be time to leave Odessa and head to Crimea to help with the defense there. I like this summation of the fighting for Ukraine by David Glantz. The prolonged struggle in the Ukraine, with its dramatic and catastrophic encirclements at Uman in late July and at Kiev in September, seriously damaged the Red Army and destroyed the coherence of Soviet strategic defenses. Over a period of almost 3 months, Germany eliminated upwards of 1 million soldiers, the entire Southwestern Front and the better part of the Southern Front, from the Red Army's order of battle. And this. In every respect, the Wehrmacht achieved signal victories at Uman and Kiev, victories that in no way diminished hopes or capabilities for the success of Operation Barbarossa. If Barbarossa were to fail, the blame did not belong to Hitler's Kiev venture. Now, that is a pretty serious statement, but I'm inclined to believe him. It is true that Army Group Center has not been driving on Moscow since mid-August, and it is true that a bunch of its strength was diverted down south to the fight for Ukraine. Hitler has called for a renewed drive on Moscow, and if that operation lasts into the Russian winter, then there might be serious ramifications for the Germans. but I don't really see how that possible eventuality could be blamed on Kiev. First of all, Hitler diverted an awful lot of force from the center to the north as well to help in the fight for Leningrad. But second of all, and mainly, we saw Army Group Center stopped and forced to go on the defensive. We saw weeks when the panzers were pulled out of the line for refitting. We saw the colossal logistical problems where the motorized units were hundreds of kilometers in front of the infantry, and saw those motorized units seriously diminished in numbers and quality. And we saw Soviet counterattacks like at Yelnya that not only stopped the Germans, but even beat them. And there's this. If Heinz Guderian had not headed south and helped destroy the 600,000 soldiers in 4 armies that seriously threatened Army Group Center's flank, then they would even more seriously threaten that flank during Typhoon. Guderian has also pretty much cleared the Bryansk road to Moscow. The 3 fronts still facing Army Group Center, Reserve, Western, and Bryansk, have been so weakened by now that it is questionable what sort of defense they can even muster. And now down south, what is there facing Army Group South that can prevent its advance through the Donbass to Rostov? But while the Germans are taking new territory, they're also losing some. This week, in a now formerly occupied part of Yugoslavia, Josip Broz Tito's partisans take the town of Uzice, whose rifle factory can produce 400 rifles a day. Actually, this week sees the beginning of the Republic of Uzice. This is the first territory to be liberated from German conquest. Yugoslavia fell a few months ago, but the underground resistance there is already organized and features 2 main camps: Tito's communist partisans and Draža Mihailovic's Chetniks, loyal to the Yugoslav government in exile. On the 21st, Franz Böhme, German commander there, pulls out from Uzice under resistance pressure. And on the 24th, the Republic begins. I say that with air quotes because it's an unusual entity. It does not have a strict or permanent border because its dimensions ebb and flow with the movements of its people and its enemies. But it's roughly 19,000 square kilometers, and there are around 1 million people living there. Since there are 2 different powers, there is dual authority and dual army command, though the partisans contribute more militarily. They are in Uzice, and the Chetniks headquartered in Požega. You will see a lot more about this and how it all went down in a special episode about the Republic of Uzice. And with that, I will end this regular episode with action in China, action seemingly ending near Leningrad, post-action action in Ukraine, and a new free country in occupied Europe, which has infuriated Adolf Hitler, of course. But then again, a lot of things seem to do that. But he's now focusing on Moscow, because taking that will win the war. Or will it? I know Hitler says that, but every few weeks since Barbarossa began on June 22nd comes something that's supposed to end the war here. Taking the first objectives that were supposed to do it, didn't do it. Taking the next ones, didn't do it. Taking prisoners in the millions, hasn't done it. Stalin has withdrawn his armament factories to way beyond Moscow by this time anyway. He's producing tons of new tanks and planes, and he's got a lot of land and people and soldiers beyond Moscow. Will Hitler taking Moscow end the fight? I don't know. And there's still a long way to Moscow. If you would like to see some of the Yugoslavian situation before the war, you can click here for one of our Between Two Wars episodes about that. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Casino dal Pizzol? Okay, Casino dal Pizzol. Thank you, Casino dal... Wait, he's been a Time Ghost Army member since like 2017, right? Yes. That's one of the first ones. I remember the name. Okay. It is the Time Ghost Army that funds our productions, and the way to get more of them is to join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time.